After studying this module, you shall be able to understand the basic concepts underlying language acquisitions, know the importance of cognitive development of language as well as cross-cultural understanding of the acquisition. Understand the basic concept of bilingualism, note the relationship between cross-cultural influences and bilingualism. With the readings of previous modules, you are now familiar with the theoretical position of cross-cultural psychology and contemporary perspective on culture and cognition. Also, we have discussed the cross-cultural influences on various cognitive processes like perception, learning and memory, intelligence and its various facets. In this module, we take the discussions on cross-cultural influences on cognition by concentrating on language acquisition. Studying language is important as language forms a powerful tool which influences the way we see. Conceptual link between language acquisition and cognitive development. Language acquisition. The APA defines language production as what people say, sign and write as well as the processes they go through to produce these messages. Language acquisition is one of the most prized human abilities. The written language is often credited with starting of civilization. Vygotsky called language as the designated form of semiotic intercession bridging the interpsychological and intrapsychological processes. Language therefore can be considered as serving dual functions. It is a tool for communication and mediates human mental action. Earliest studies on language were done in Wundtian times. The major thrust in this field was provided by a revolutionary field of grammar by Noam Chomsky. The idea of language is now being considered as a cultural trend with socially embedded communication system. This is a shift from earlier conception of language which were derived primarily from Chomsky theory of grammar as shown in the figure. Studies being done in the field of language acquisitions have shown a massive alteration. Instead of focusing on universal theories of acquisitions, the researchers are now focusing on disparities and parallels across different languages. Therefore, the focus is now on moving beyond universality of Chomsky theory towards a more empiristic view. Cognitive development. Language acquisition and cognitive development have always assumed a close relationship. It is generally believed that certain level of conceptual strategies and prerequisites are important for the development of precise linguistic skills. Researchers like Slobin have suggested certain opportunities principles which enable an uniformity while scrutinizing the linguistic inputs. The principles are crucial to understand the differences and similarities across attainment of different languages. This has been supported by the research on sentence processing. The competition model of sentence processing by Bates and McWhinney suggests that the information value of a linguistic form depends on the frequency and consistency of occurrence and weight assigned to these by the users. Research in the area of cognitive development also takes into the account the impact of the caregiver's language on the child. It is believed that the child tends to inculcate certain aspects of the mother's speech into his or her own. However, research on this particular theme has been so far from being decisively conclusive. Language acquisition and cognitive development. Three perspectives that links language acquisition and cognitive development are: first, language determine cognition development. Sapir-Whorf hypothesis proposed linguistic relativity principle. This principle purports that there are variations in the manner people encode cultural and cognitive categories in their language. Essentially, a language affects a manner in which people think and behave in different cultures. Thus, according to them, language determines the cognitive development. Second, cognitive development determines language acquisitions. Many theories propose that cognitive development affects the language development of the people. Chomsky is one of the proponents who proposed that there is a language acquisition device in the brain of human being that facilitates the language acquisition in the brain. Third, language acquisition and cognitive development are bidirectional. According to Vygotsky, language and cognitive development develop as a separate system within the child's brain. As they develop, at the age of 3 years, the two systems become interdependent and affect each other. However, though both overlap and still work as a distinct entity working independently at several times. Now, cross-cultural inferences of language acquisition and processing. The relation between language acquisition and cognitive developments has been highlighted in almost all theories of child development, including Piaget's famous developmental theory. However, this acquisition does not take place in complete isolation. Culture exerts an important influence on this aspect as well. Since cultural influence on language acquisition is immense, we will restrict ourselves to only a few topics such as language acquisition, language socialization, verbal interactions. First, language acquisition. It has been proven beyond doubt that language acquisition takes place in a social context. However, these effects not the same in every culture. Differences have been observed in the formal structure and the grammatical devices of different languages, which pose a multitude of difficulties for the child evolved. For example, English with its fairly mixed word orders contrasts sharply with languages which has a variable order necessitating the requirement of differential device for grammatical relations. Further, it has been shown that differences in different languages exist in the form of voice intensity, utterance, quality, rate of articulation, etc. Mahler has shown that a child's early speech sounds are modeled after the specific prevalent languages in that culture. In the English language, a small number of phonemes can be represented in many ways. In the Spanish language, on the other hand, there is a considerably small number of graphemes to present judicious number of sounds. It has also been seen that children learn to discriminate between sounds of different language when they have been exposed to a plurilingual environment. At the end, it is the verbal interaction of the child with their adult environment that causes the child to develop suitable strategies for acquisition. There is an enormous evidence to support cross-cultural variation in the process and style of languages development. For example, there are two styles of composition of early vocabulary. First, referential, and second is expressive. The referential children show preference towards common nouns. These occurs when the child has more contact with the adult than the peer group. On the other hand, expressive children show predominance towards personal social words, proper nouns, action words, and routine social phrases. Acquisition of language is considered to change thought in fundamental ways, and written languages is one more important aspect. The dilemma whether written language promotes logical and abstract thinking in a way that oral language is unable to do has been pondered over by scholars like Plato and Socrates. It has been argued that disciplines like history and logic cannot be possible without written language. Most importantly, the written language has a sense of permanency to carry on certain process. Thus, language acquisition in written form serve a crucial function in our understanding of the world. Language socialization. Socialization may be defined as a lifelong process of inheriting and propagating norms, cultures and ideologies necessary for participating in one's own society. Language socialization is thus an important aspect of adjustment to one's society. It can be defined as a process of socialization through language and socialization to use language. In order to use language in a culturally suitable manner, the child needs to integrate the knowledge acquired through social cultural ways with entrenched meaning. Competence in their social cultural purposes and interaction is achieved through social interaction. Language in such circumstances fulfill dual function, that is, acting as a transmitter of social cultural knowledge as well as medium of socialization. The role of the mother in such interaction is central. The mother, through her framework of created meaning, describes the behavior of the child. The child's language acquisition is facilitated by the caregiver's technique such as marked stress, chunking, repetition, substitution, expansion, etc. Social interactions have different routines across different cultures, which involve a set of patterns of linguistic forms and structures required for language development. Research done in the field has provided us an insight into cultural differences in the process of language socialization. It is generally seen that the infant-adult verbal interaction are focused more on social relations than object manipulation in the Kung tribes in Kalahari. Rabin and Jamin compared the style of West African and French mothers in Paris. It has seen that African mothers are less responsive to the child's object-related verbal interaction while being more responsive towards their social initiatives. It appears that African mothers were more interested in placing greater emphasis on defining and initiating the child into a network and hierarchy of social relationship. Watson and Diogi have done extensive studies on the language socialization in Kwara's children in Malatya. Their themes was the calling out and repetition routines in language socialization. They found that the parents' calling out routines were imitated by children in their play activities. The caregivers often taught their infants what to say and reinforced it through repetition. This prompting by the adult presents the children with a model of socially acceptable language rules. This in turn allows the child to understand the social status according to suitable use of language. Similar studies have been done for Anglo-American children, etc. All the cross-cultural studies on language socialization primarily focus on different speech acts. Some of these include shaming, teasing and assertion. These acts are used in socially structured interactional milieu, exposure to which forms an important facet of language socialization. Verbal interaction. The earlier studies in the field of language socialization were dominated by mother-child dyad characteristics of the Euro-American culture. However, with an upcoming research, the focus is now shifting on a polydaic interaction typical of non-Western communities. It is generally the norm that the child's social interaction with caregiver will be embedded in the context of polydaic verbal exchanges. For example, the role of a grandmother and other adult in the language acquisition of joint families of India is considered important. Appropriate verbal routines are exemplified by orientation of the children towards different cultural priorities. These priorities include people or object-centered communication, status, hierarchy, etc., which presents the child with opposite exposure, practice and purposive instructions. These exchanges have a value orientation and implications for social and communicative development. The child's functions precedence and stylistic penchant are a function of the interaction with mothers as well as older adults in terms of intrusiveness, conversational intent, etc. For example, African mothers tend to show more physical postural demonstration than verbal, with an emphasis on interpersonal communication rather than referential. Reben Zebin have also shown that African children fewer restriction on direct manipulation of object. Because of this, it becomes more educative for them to verbal interactions highlighting social and interpersonal relations. Till recently, much of the research in the field of linguistics has focused on acquisition of a single language. However, changing times have focused on the importance of a very relevant concept in global time, which is bilingualism. In most non-Western societies, children are bilingual. This does not only refers to acquisition of two languages, but also to adjustment with two different cultures. Due to this importance, we devote the section of this chapter to bilingualism. Now, associative facts between bilingualism and cognitive development. Bilingualism, due to its varied nature and differential context, bilingualism does not have a single composite definition. Instead, has identified four types of definition. Definitions by concept view it as a developmental phenomena. Definitions by competence are based on the proficiency in two or more languages. Functional definitions encompasses the functions served by the language for its user, and social psychologists view in terms of identification or the individualistic attitude toward the language. We have seen a tremendous change in the notions of bilingualism and its impact on individuals and society. This is due to the immense socio-linguistic, ethno-linguistic and psycho-linguistic work done in the field, as people speaking different languages have migrated to different countries and acculturation takes place to ensure their integration into the host culture. The perception of bilingualism has changed from simplistic sum of two or more language abilities to a more holistic system of pluralistic competencies. Assessment of bilingualism poses a major precedent due to the monolingual bias of the Western countries. In today's time, there are majorly two tests for study of bilingualism, a test in which seeks to find the commonality between the monolingual, bilingual, and other which seeks to determine the proficiencies of the bilingual vis-a-vis monolingual. Cognitive development. There are two types of bilingualism. First, simultaneous bilingualism refers to the acquisition of two or more languages during early childhood. In such a case, the development of the other languages is as similar as natural as the first language without any restrict or conscious training. Second, successive bilingualism refers to the deliberate and formal learning of the other language by the individual later in life. Earlier, it was believed that simultaneously bilingualism is much more efficient for the acquisition of a new language. However, no such cognitive biases has been revealed during research. Both forms of bilingualism have equal proficiencies in terms of applications and use of language. Fishman suggests the way in which bilingual adaptedness affects the cognitive process. He says that lexical items and linguistic structures of different languages enable an individual to encode his experiences in diverse and different ways, thereby enriching their cognitive systems. Leopold demonstrates through his own bilingual daughter the acceleration of the process of distinction between the name and the object due to exposure to the multiple words for a single object. Mohanty shows that not only were the bilingual children more skilled in detecting structural ambiguity in sentences, they were also more likely to utilize intonational cues in detecting the meaning of sentences, due to the development of reflective skills acquired as a result of the bilingual exposure. The child is able to acquire greater cognitive functions. The predominant cognitive theory used to understand the influence of cultural knowledge on language behavior is schema theory. According to this theory, knowledge is saved in the form of schemata. The schemas operate in a top-down fashion and help in collection of input information. Thus, schema theory serve as an important tool in understanding the relations with personal background and language performance. When presented with culturally familiar information in the first or second language, the recollection is exceptional for both children and adults. The schema theory is summarized in the figure cross-cultural influences on bilingualism. Despite presence of overwhelming evidence supporting the existence of link between bilingualism and intellectual performance, it would not be feasible to ignore the cultural context of bilingualism. It is imperative to note that at an extensive level the philosophy of bilingualism has a socio-cultural phenomena difference from monolingual to multilingual nations. For example, in a country like India, bilingualism is a tactic for continuance of linguistic multiplicity instead of being a transition towards language shift. Since the social norm encourages the individual in favor of many languages instead of one, bilingualism can be considered as a constructive approach in pluralistic and multilingualistic societies, provided the other socio-cultural factors are controlled. Bilingualism is an interesting phenomena from the perspective of social psychology, as sharing of languages represents a sharing of culture as well. This includes not only the attitude of an individual towards another culture group but also the nature of intergroup relations in culture and language contact group. This contact can be both detrimental as well as advantageous. When favorable, it leads to an additive and stable bilingualism, whereas when damaging, it may lead to a subtractive or transitional bilingualism. Therefore, it becomes vital for the social psychologists to understand the fundamental principles underlying these processes of intergroup contact of interaction. Some of the important social psychology models and theories of maintenance of culture and linguistic distance are: first, ethno-linguistic vitality model of intergroup relation and language maintenance, given by Giles, Boris and Taylor in 1977. Second, model of communicative competence in second language, given by Clement 1980. Third, the model of cultural relations in the plural societies, given by Berry 1980. Now, ethno-linguistic vitality model of intergroup relations and language maintenance. In this model, Giles and his associates have identified a set of three groups vitality factors in order to predict the outcome in a case of language contact situation. These include social support factors, which are inclusive of socio-political and economic power of the ethno-linguistic group along with the status of ethnic language. Demographic factors that are inclusive of the size, concentration and the pattern of distribution of group under consideration in the given geographical area, and the factors of institutional support that the language and its users enjoy from socio-political institutions like education, media, government and organized social movement. In addition to these general objective factors of ethno-linguistic vitality, Boris, Giles and Residential also suggested the perceived or subjective vitality. This suggestion has been supported by research wherein these are used to explain intergroup relations and language attitudes in a variety of linguistic settings like Israel, Spanish Basque and Spanish Galician area, etc. Now, model of communicative competence in second language. This model proposed two levels of social motivation process, that is primary and secondary. The primary social motivation involves antagonistic relationships of individuals' affective temperament towards the other culture and the fear of assimilation, that is the fear that by learning the second language, the first language might be lost. These two tendencies interrelate subtractively to establish the net primary motivational tendencies. These tendencies in turn exercise an effect on secondary motivation. This motivation ascertains the contact and with the second language that enables the communicative competencies in that language. The major shortcomings of this model is the assumption that contact with the second language is always a matter of choice, which might be the case in most linguistic societies. Now third, model of cultural relation in plural societies. This model describes the psychological process of acculturation in circumstances of contact between different cultural groups both at individual as well as community level. The basis of this model is the analysis of acculturation attitudes across different cultures. This may be defined as the ways in which individuals or group of one culture wishes to relate to the other group. This acculturation attitudes involves choices along two dimensions. These are related to, it is related to preserving one's own identity, culture, language and way of life. Second, it is related to structuring and sustaining relations with other groups. The framework of Berry's model help in understanding the socio-linguistic outcome of language. Stable bilingualism and language maintenance can be viewed as a product of integrative relationship in the language contact situation. On the other hand, assimilative orientation may lead to transitional bilingualism, which results in a language shift. Assimilative orientation may come from within or outside group. When the transition is forced upon the dominant group, it is extremely stressful as it is often accompanied by the forceful loss of the language as well as culture. In such a situation, if the minority group is separation oriented, then they will form strong linguistic nationalism and show divergence with negative attitude toward the dominant language group. On the other hand, if the dominant group also allows the non-dominant group to retain its distinctiveness, isolation dysfunction of the minority language. Berry's model is one of the most successful used model in research of bilingualism. His model has been used by Trindis to analyze the multilingual and multilingual societies of Singapore and Malaysia. Similar work has been done by Mohanty and Kond tribes in India. Thus, we see that both the language acquisition as well as language socialization has impacted our lives along with the rising culture of bilingualism. Now, the summary of the module. Vygotsky called language as the designated form of semiotic intercession, bridging the interpsychological and intrapsychological processes. Language therefore can be considered as serving dual function. It is a tool for communication and mediates human mental action. It is generally believed that certain level of conceptual strategies and prerequisites are important for the development of precise linguistic skills. Research in the area of cognitive development also takes into account the impact of caregiver's language on the child. The cross-cultural research has been generated on topics such as language acquisitions, language socialization and verbal interaction. Kuntab Gangas has identified 4 types of definitions of bilingualism. Definitions by concept view it as a developmental phenomena. Definition by competence are based on the proficiency in 2 or more languages. Functional definition encompasses the functions served by the language for its user, and social psychologist views in terms of identification or the individual's attitude toward the language. Assessment of bilingual poses a major precedence due to the monolingual bias of the Western countries. The predominant cognitive theory used to understand the influence of cultural knowledge on language behavior is the schema theory. The philosophy of bilingualism as a social culture phenomena differs from monolingual to multilingual nations. Some of the important social psychology model and theories for maintenance of culture and linguistic distance are ethno-linguistic vitality model of intergroup relations and language maintenance, model of communicative competence in second language, model of cultural relation in plural society.